Enlightenment is a term frequently used and discussed. It's a term that comes up when we talk about spirituality and also sometimes when we talk about historical European art and science. Enlightenment comes up in that context too. However, the definition is very ambiguous to most people who haven't explored the authentic teachings of the secret doctrine or the Dharma. In contrast, a Buddhist from any school of Buddhism is taught very specific definitions of enlightenment, each with specific differentiations depending on the level of attainment. In almost all of their contexts, the term lacks precise characteristics and levels. So because of the misuse of the term, many people are misled or uncertain about what it really entails. And unfortunately, a lot of people continue to live in delusion and samsara because they had experienced a level of dhyana or samadhi in meditation and thought that that was their indication that they had reached enlightenment, when in fact those experiences were just temporary liberations. In Theravada Buddhism, the early school, the terms and conditions for enlightenment are very precise. It's important to understand the formula or stages of enlightenment because without that, it would be difficult to judge one's own place in the path, and even the lack of understanding the definitions of enlightenment can actually inhibit it from happening because the definitions contain comprehensions that in fact eliminate some ego, just the intellectual understanding of these concepts. There are variations in the teachings of the levels of attainment in the sutta. The classical formula teaches 4 stages of enlightenment. And another important structure is the 10 fetters, which are the primary bindings that a person needs to overcome in order to attain complete liberation. These are afflictions that are associated with mental defects that must be eroded to free the consciousness. So the first stage of enlightenment is called Sotāpanna. Sota means stream, and apanna refers to someone who is entering something. So the term is usually translated as stream enterer. The term is also used to describe the action of stream entry, and it's said that Sotāpanna refers to flowing upstream against the current of life and progressing in evolution as a soul instead of downstream or downhill like the majority of beings in nature. So in this context, to flow downstream means to follow the typical tendency of beings, which is to pursue pleasure and avoid effort and pain. And consequently, this deteriorates the consciousness. It makes us a slave to desire and sensations and only perpetuates suffering. Choosing to move upward in evolution requires continuous effort and is more like a gradual ascent rather than a fast and easy river raft ride. So Sotāpanna refers to entering the stream, and the stream represents the flow of life. But there's also another analogy for nirvana, or liberation, which is referred to as the far shore. So the stream of life is a great obstacle for us because the current is so strong, and in order to attain enlightenment, we must either move upstream or cross the stream to get to the far shore. The shore that we are on right now is the metaphor for our current state in samsara. It is a shore that occasionally floods and drowns us in problems. It's taught that the first stage of enlightenment can be achieved by both laypeople and monastics. During the Buddha's era, he claimed that many thousands of people were attaining Sotāpanna or stream entry. When you reach Sotāpanna, you receive a final comprehension that appears as quick as a thought, and it changes you fundamentally. You lose a great deal of your repetitive egoic mind and suddenly perceive everything with a very distinct clarity that is different than before. It neutralizes the very crude and animalistic characteristics we have, particularly anger and greed and desire. Those animal qualities of our mind that can make us so enraged or consumed by desire that we kill or steal or lie. These are actions that we generally only take when we're heavily provoked. The comprehension that leads one into stream entry dramatically reduces these tendencies. This is a key indication of Sotāpanna. Once a person reaches this first stage of enlightenment, the dormant defects that can cause us to become violent and harm or kill or steal and lie are almost completely eliminated. And at the same time, there is a stronger sense of relation and coexistence with other people and living creatures, and a greater capacity for empathy and compassion. This is unlike a socio or psychopath who manages to disassociate from reality and other people so as to feel separate and no longer responsible when they cause harm. So the realization of Sotāpanna is truly an awakening that is beyond the mere choice to follow ethics and behave well. It is a fundamental transformation in the psyche. A major contributor to this enlightenment comes from contemplating the three primordial characteristics of existence, which are impermanence, dissatisfaction, or dukkha, and insubstantiality, or anatta, which is the intrinsic emptiness of self-identity and emptiness of value in all things. When one reflects on these fundamental principles deeply, one's entire motivation changes because one realizes how frivolous and fruitless and unreliable the pleasures of the material world are. At this point, the way in which we continue through life is dramatically different. There is an abandoning of consumerism and selfish interests, and a striving for greater creativity and value in life by providing for others. Now, regarding the 10 fetters that hinder spiritual awakening, 3 of them are overcome at Sotāpanna. The first one is the almost unquestionable conviction that we all have an individual self-identity or character that exists and endures through time. But contrary to this widespread materialistic perception, the Buddha taught that when one looks into oneself, one does not find him or herself, but instead finds nobody. When this truth is confirmed through direct experience or perception, usually in meditation, then the false concept of individual identity completely vanishes from the psyche. There is also the mistaken idea that residual psychic aggregates that believe in the concept of self-identity remain even after receiving this comprehension. But that is inaccurate. Sotāpanna transcends the belief in individual selfhood completely. The second fetter is doubt regarding the essential teachings of the Dhamma. Doubt and skepticism disappear when the truth is experienced or perceived. So the comprehensions of this can come at different levels. At one level, one may notice many observable phenomena or events in the physical world that seem to be congruent with the Buddha's teachings. At another level, one can receive insights in meditation that confirm physical facts, or one can practice and go deeper and enter the jhanas and experience direct perception of reality. The third fetter is sometimes called the abandonment of attachment to belief in rites and rituals as a means to salvation. The Pali term for this is sīlabbata-parāmāsa, often translated as conviction about rites and rituals. By rites and rituals, the teaching is also referring to ethical or virtuous behavior. In other words, believing that good deeds and exterior actions by themselves are sufficient in leading to salvation is false. This fetter is overcome when one understands that wisdom is the only means of attaining liberation. Another condition that defines full awakening is the steadfastness of the enlightenment. So if the intensity of the awakening or the samadhi declines and fades away after some days, weeks, months, or years, then the awakening was only a temporary experience of liberation. It was not complete enlightenment. Sotāpannas can maintain the household life. They can experience emotional reactions of anger and desire if directly provoked, but their reactions are milder and will not cause perverted or violent behavior. So one is not absolutely free of defects, so it is possible to experience some depression or otherwise, but he or she is well on their way to complete enlightenment. And this is something that could happen in the next 10 minutes or in the next life or so. It is also taught that Sotāpannas can take a maximum of 7 lifetimes to attain complete liberation. Regarding the meditative jhanas, Sotāpannas may or may not be able to access the jhanas at will, and the ones who cannot refer to their ability to enter the jhanas as the indication of enlightenment, since many people who practice meditation can become very skillful and enter the jhanas regularly without having eliminated all of their psychological defects. The second stage of enlightenment is called sakkayaditthi, which means once returner. This means that full enlightenment can be attained in 1 or 2 lives, hence the possible need to return once to complete the work. At this stage, no fetters remain. The 5th and 6th fetters, in particular, anger and desire, are further reduced to atomic dust, rendering the awakened person perfectly ethical in action and will, free from desire and negativity, and highly pure psychologically. Although anger and desire are substantially diminished at this level, it is possible to experience these dense emotions if provoked. These defects still exist in a dormant state, but do not arise spontaneously as with negative thinking and fantasy. This is an advanced stage of enlightenment. However, sakkayaditthis do not always have the ability to access the jhanas at will. The third stage is called anagami. This literally means non-future, in which the word future refers to agami karma, or karmic consequences that will occur in the future. So anagami can also be translated as without future karma. There will be no need to return in future lives to complete the great liberation. The anagami stage is usually just called the non-returning stage. They are non-returners. This is a highly exalted level of attainment, in which 5 of the 10 fetters, including the dense fetters of anger, greed, and lust, have been completely eliminated. By nature, anagamis are intrinsically pure, so not only do they share the same ethical lifestyle as monks and nuns, but they are naturally celibate and psychologically cleansed of sensual and material desires, divorced from the usual motivations of people. It is possible to continue living like a layperson in the household life at the anagami stage, and there are several Buddhist narratives that illustrate this. One of them being the story of Gatikara, the potter, who was unable to live in a monastery because he had to tend to his aged and blind parents. But he was content with this lifestyle because he saw no lasting value in the common worldly life. Now with anagami, the last 5 fetters remain, and they are subtle. There tends to remain attachment and pleasure in the various meditative states, particularly the 4 jhanas and the arupa meditations, or formless realms. These attachments are very refined, as they are of a spiritual nature, but they are nonetheless obstacles. There still remains the subtle affliction of mental restlessness, which for anagamis is the subtle movement or wandering of the mind from thought to thought. This means that although the mind is substantially pure, it is not fundamentally still and free of habitual and mechanical thoughts and aggregates. The movement of this type is akin to a gentle breeze that rustles the leaves from time to time. Having said that, the mind of an anagami is not perversely active and constantly distracted by impressions and thoughts like in the case of everyday people. Another fetter remaining is known as conceit, which at this stage is really just a trace sense of self. However, this subtle sense of self is not considered sakkayaditthi, or conviction of and sense of individual self-identity, and so forth, because this was already eliminated at the first stage of enlightenment. This residual sense of self is comparable to washing out a strong shirt stain from turmeric sauce or cherries or greasy metal car parts. One may be able to wash out the majority of the stain, the strong color, the grease, and the smell, but what can remain is a slight discoloration of the clothing from white to off-white, for example. At the same time, because trace amounts of fetters still exist, so too does ignorance still exist. It is generally at the level of anagami when one can access the jhanas and samadhi very easily, and there is more inclination to do so. The final stage of enlightenment is known as arahant. The title, lifestyle, and way of the arahant can be called arahantship. At this level of awakening, the remaining 5 fetters, attachment to meditative states, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance, are all reduced to cosmic dust, and the awakened one becomes a completely unconditioned, enlightened being. Upon attaining this, future rebirths in the physical plane are no longer necessary. Since the arahant is fully awakened, it is possible that their natural and ongoing state of consciousness can remain in samadhi. With that being said, it is also not necessary that the arahant has the ability to easily access the arupa, formless meditations. This is not intrinsic to arahantship. One thing that is worth considering is that some schools of Buddhism caution students to not become too attached to the bliss of the jhanas and the form and formless heavens. But this is somewhat contradictory advice, because it's not even possible to become free of the attachment to the jhanas until one reaches arahantship. In fact, the Buddha taught that samadhi, the 4th jhana, is the final step in the Eightfold Path. So the jhanas and samadhi are in fact a means to final liberation. The jhanas themselves are a means of liberation from the attachment to jhana. At any stage of spiritual development, it's important to be aware that the ability to experience the jhanas and samadhi at will is not an indication that one is fully enlightened. One must always refer to the conditions of the 4 stages of enlightenment.